recording, no dropped frames. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Let's just see where we're at for the semester right now. So I'm thinking that we'll do the midterm in 3 weeks, which will put us at week 9 for the midterm, which is probably okay, especially since we lost a week. So let's plan on that. Next week we'll talk a little bit more about it. Assignment-wise, assignment number 3 should be fairly straightforward. The basic idea is that you're changing it from 2 columns to 3 columns. And right now we're just using Flexbox. So on assignment number 3, just to be clear, I don't want you using any floats. We're going to try to get away from floats. So floats were really kind of more of an assignment 2 thing. Assignment 3, we're going to get away from that. That's an older technique. This is probably actually the last semester I'm going to teach it. I think it's probably more confusing than it's worth, especially because it's kind of a few years ago when I decided to start teaching Flexbox and grid and floats and all that at the same time. Not all browsers supported it, and it wasn't a common technique yet, but I'm thinking that it's kind of one of those things. It's still a usable technique, but it's just such an old technique, I don't think it's really worth it after this semester, okay? So going forward, we're generally not going to use floats. The only time we'll use floats is kind of for the classic example of where you've got a picture and you want to wrap some text around it, like the newspaper article type deal where, you know what I mean? I don't know if there's a specific name for it, but that's pretty much the only time we're going to use float from now on. So now going forward, don't use floats for layout anymore. It was just to kind of show you that it's possible. If you want to put a couple things side by side, you can float a box left, float a box right, clear the floats. We will use margin auto as a centering technique because that's still pretty useful. I still use that. There's other ways to do it, but to me, that's probably the simplest. It's just to have a fixed width div, say 800 pixel div as your main container, and then just set margin auto and boom. It's like you've got all your content centered. It's a pretty nice technique, so we'll still use that. Assignment number 2 is graded. So what I generally did was like 95 was the starting point, so that's kind of like a mid-level A. And that was like assuming that you fulfilled all the requirements, which pretty much everybody did. And then if I saw you made a little bit of effort, the grade would go up. And then if you made maybe some coding mistakes or something, go down. So most people got between like a 94 and then like a 98, kind of in that range. So most people did pretty well. I try to reserve the hundreds in this class because since you're seniors, for the people who really do something interesting. But you can still get an A in the course. You can still get a high A in the course. You just may not necessarily get 100. I think that's not being too ridiculous. I think that's pretty fair because you'll still make it out of the course with an A, even a high A. You just won't necessarily get a perfect. I know some people really like to get that 100 and have a perfect grade in the course, but in the end, it doesn't really matter because all people see on your transcript is whether you get an A. And in general, what's that?
All they see is the letter grade, not
yeah, exactly. So don't focus on that too much. If I gave you like, say, a 95 and you felt like you may deserve a 97 or 98, you're kind of kind of nitpicking at that point. If we get to the end of the semester and you're very close to an A, I am pretty forgiving about things like that, is that maybe we can dig up some of your old assignments and maybe you can make some arguments why something should have gotten a few more points. But let's not worry about it too much for now. Assignment number 3, the basic idea is that you're going to get some practice using Flexbox. And in assignment number 2, the only thing we used Flexbox for was the navigation. And then assignment number 3 basically has 2 parts. So assignment number 3 is that you're going to be using Flexbox to lay out some content inside, like this idea of a card. And then we did an example. If this is confusing at all, look at last week's example and last week's lecture video. But the basic idea was to come up with this idea of a card, and we'll do a more complete example of a card today to help you out if you're confused at all. And then we also combined media queries. And then we had a breakpoint, and then the idea was that once you get to kind of very narrow device, typically like a cell phone, then we would go from, basically we would go to having like a column design to where it's just a single column. Okay, everyone's good with that? We're gonna do some more complete examples with Flexbox. Let me take a step back. Okay, so Flexbox. So let's briefly talk about the history. I know time is a little bit limited, but when they first created the web, all we had essentially were tables, and tables are really, really bad for layouts. And then we got floats. Sorry. And then we got floats, and people were like, okay, this is a little bit better than using tables, and we started to use layouts for floats. And now it's kind of our two things to reach for many years were for floats and tables. Then maybe, I don't know, 5 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, we got something called Flexbox. Flexbox was great because doing very simple things, something as simple as I have a row of things, say for example our navigation. I've got 5 links and I just want to evenly spread them across the top. Using floats and tables and all that would have been either difficult or not optimal. It just not good in general. But as you saw with Flexbox, it's very easy. What do? I just set display as flex and then justify content and then whatever you want, either space between or space around. Now, we also saw that Flexbox is cool because we can set it to either a point in row or in column. Now, I didn't want to get too much into the details. There is this idea of the main axis and the cross axis. That might be a little bit overly technical, but the main idea is that the main axis is kind of the content, the direction the content is pointing. So say for example, if I've got, if I'm pointing in the row direction, my main axis would be this way, and my cross axis would be this way. But if I decided to set it up as a column, what would happen? They would flip. Now my main axis is vertical, and my cross axis is the other way. I wish they had come up with better terminology. That's why I've sort of avoided the terms main axis and cross axis. But just take a step back. The idea is that if I've got essentially if I'm trying to display content in one direction, that works really well. Flexbox is really good for that. So keep that in your mind. Keep some examples like, okay, I'm going to use Flexbox for navigation. It works really, really well for navigation. It does. You can use it for broader page layouts. Do something like this today, where this would be a good example of Flexbox. Ignore this. Say, for example, you've got a logo on the left and then some links over here. This is actually a perfect example of like classic Flexbox because it's all in one direction. We're going to learn something at the end of class today called grid. Grid is when you want to go in two directions. So you can see here I've got content going this way and this way. Now we can actually get very clever to where we can actually do things like this, where we've got a grid and like this grid is taking up like 2/3, 1/3 type deal. This probably wouldn't be optimal for Flexbox. But anyway, we're going to learn about grid, but keep this in your head that in general, Flexbox is good when you're doing things in one direction. And we've just got either one row or one column of things. We're going to use grid when we've got things kind of going in two directions. Now this grid system is fairly simple, but we can actually do some incredibly advanced things. We're not going to do this in this class. I'm trying to keep things simple. I'm trying to give you practical skills, not theoretical skills that you'll never use. So I always try to think back, what have I actually used in practice on websites? But if you're ever curious, there's a site called Grid by Example. And they show you all the cool different grids you can do. So you could do something like this, you could do something like this. And obviously, so what happened is that each of these would be content. Okay? So notice that this would be, something like this would be really, really tough inside of using Flexbox. But with grid, it's fairly simple. We'll start grid at the end. But I just want you to get the big picture view. I know I'm burning through time. But so we started off using kind of floats we're going to abandon that for now. I just wanted to show you that technique is possible and get some practice using floats. Moving forward, we're going to start using Flexbox. Flexbox is when you want content to go in one direction, and then we have all kinds of different ways within that one direction to align things. And then we're going to switch over to grid. Okay, everybody's good with that? So let's go ahead and get started with a new example. So what I'm going to do today is very small, manageable, little bite-sized examples. And then next lecture, I think what I'm going to do is we're going to spend the whole lecture doing one big example. One of the problems I always had in school was that we would get these little bite-sized examples, and then it's like, okay, that's great. How do I use that in a real web page? And so that's what I'm going to do over the next 2 weeks. Is today I'll give you little tiny examples, and then we'll take that next week and make a large website. So it's kind of complementary lectures. So let's go ahead and create a new folder for today. Today is the 24th. So everyone feels good about where we are. Nobody feels overly lost. This is actually peak difficulty of the content. This is where it gets the most difficult, and then from there on, we're actually going to use these libraries that kind of let you cheat a little bit, like Bootstrap and other things, and then it's going to actually get easier. So this is like the arc of difficulty in here. So if you feel like you're doing okay in these next couple of weeks, you should be able to get through the rest of the semester. So you made a new folder for today. Pointed at that folder. And then you do have assignment number 4. Bless you. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but this is a fun little thing. Has anybody seen this before, Flexbox Froggy? Because Flexbox has so many different capabilities, I want to say somebody at Facebook or Twitter or something like that, came up with this so you could just get some practice. And it's just kind of like a fun little thing. So the idea is that this frog, you have to line up on the lily pads, and they get kind of more extreme. So what you'd have to do is you'd have to figure out how, using just Flexbox, how can I get these frogs to line up? And you don't have to complete the whole thing, but you'll get the idea. It's like, okay, so in this case, I might want to justify content. This to me looks like space between. And it's like, okay, we've got them lined up, but now we need to do alignment in this direction on the cross-axis. So we use align items, and it's nice because they have little, like you hover over it, it tells you your options. So align items, I have flex start, flex end, center, baseline stretch. Well, to me, it's at the end in the cross-axis direction. So I'd say, okay, this is probably flex end. And then, oh, okay, well, it's not space between, it's probably space around. And you get them lined up. You go on to the next thing. It's pretty cool. Okay. So let's start off with HTML shell. And let's just start off creating a more complete card. Last time our card consisted of just kind of a very generic box. Let's do a little bit more complete of a card. And let's go ahead and include this viewport meta. Save this as example 1. Make some room for our style, so we're going to have a style up here instead of our head section. So the idea is that we're going to make a card, and we want to make something kind of like the card from the Audubon Society. It's not going to be exact, but I just want, it's going to be basically picture, some sort of heading text, smaller text, just to give you an idea of what a real card might look like. Okay, I'm going to be lazy and use lots of divs. In practice, you might want to use something a little bit more appropriate. Okay, so we're going to have this thing called a card. Now on top, we're going to want some sort of image. Did I link to a... So Surprised I didn't link to it. Oh well, we can just Google for it. So if you just Google for lorem ipsum photos, the first result is pixum.photos. I'll make sure there's a link in here later. And we've used this before, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. So you get the basic idea is that whatever you put here, so this is a 200 by 300 image. Okay. So we're going to say image source equals, paste that in. We'll adjust that later. We'll adjust the pixel values later. You can even just type it in directly. You can just do pixum.photos. And then we want some sort of title to this thing, right? Because that's what they were doing over here. And then maybe like a paragraph of text. This almost might be an example where you could use article, but I don't like changing things once I've started, so. And then just a little bit of lorem ipsum text. Like maybe 3 or 4 sentences worth. Not too much. This is probably enough. Okay, so this is, I'll take a break here for a second. This is going to be our starting point. So we've got our card. We've got our image. We've got the title. And we've got a paragraph of text. Now there's not going to be any styling so far, so it's not going to be very interesting. But we get the idea. So now typically what we do with, so let's go ahead and start. We'll start off with the actual main container for the card. So .card. And let's say we want the width to be 200 pixels. We usually want to give these cards a fixed width. And just so we can see where the border is, you may or may not keep the border. Did they put a border on theirs on, yeah, they've got a thin border. So let's just do 1 pixel. And this is kind of a strange, let's just use a square image. Let's just say 200 by 200. Just get a square image here. Okay, this is a relatively small card, but let's do this. Let's make it 300 pixels wide, and then let's have a 300 by 200. Okay, so all I did was I changed the card. The width is going to be now 300 pixels. And then we also have to change our image. Yeah, this is probably closer to a typical card. There might be a little bit more text, but you get the idea. So now we've got this. This is our base card. We might want to style a little bit. So what you could do is you could say that inside the cards H1, go ahead and center that title. And then this text is kind of right up on the edge. Maybe we could just add a little bit of margin. So the paragraph inside, just give it a little bit of margin. But you get the idea, right? Maybe that's a little bit too much. You could experiment with it. But so when I say create a card, this is kind of what I'm looking for. Okay, so you could take something like this and kind of transfer the code over to your assignment. How many people have seen these before? These things that I'm calling cards on websites. Show of hands. Few people. They're a pretty popular way of just displaying content. And the nice thing is that if you use other frameworks, like these other frameworks like React and Angular, and we probably won't talk about them much in this class. I don't know. Maybe we'll have time. But what's nice about these is that you can create your own separate component so that you don't have to write the CSS and HTML every time. You can actually make a custom tag called card. And then literally, if you want a card in your page, you just do a custom tag called card. Pass it the image, pass it the text, pass it the title, and boom, you've got one of these already styled and everything. If we have time, which we may or may not, one of the things I was thinking about maybe doing is that you can actually create apps with just HTML and JavaScript these days, like actual apps that you can submit to the App Store and everything. I realize that's a little bit outside of the scope for this class, but I thought it might be, especially since you're seniors, I could kind of give you a taste of it, give you some basics and fundamentals, and then if you're interested, you can go out into the world and do that. Is anybody interested in that, if we did that maybe the last class? Okay. So we'll do that. There's a bunch of different frameworks. To me, the easiest to work with in one class period is one called React Native, but we'll worry about that later on. And the nice thing is that it's cross-platform. So you can write Android and iOS apps in one environment, and then you just follow the different directions to submit to each app store. And so maybe we'll do something simple like a recipe app or something like that. But okay, so if there's interest, that's good. Okay, any questions about this card? I think I got to pick up the pace a little bit if we want to get through everything. We good? Okay, so let's start a new example here. Use this on your assignment. And just a quick note on your assignment. I don't know if I was super clear about this. Sometimes I'll make some things implied that there's a 600 pixel breakpoint. Now, if you've got your cards as 300 pixels, which I think we might have done an example, basically part of the assignment is that sometimes you'll have to adjust these values to make things fit. I'm pretty loose about these requirements, but the idea is that if you're moving to a 3-column design, you can't have cards that are 300 pixels, 300 pixels, 300 pixels, because that adds up to 900. So what you'd have to do is make sure everything fits. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that if you decide to adjust your card size, then you also have to adjust your breakpoint size. Everyone's good with that? I'm pretty laid back as far as these go. Just keep the general spirit of it. The general spirit of that assignment is that you've got breakpoints in cards, and it's supposed to change when the media query changes. Okay, so let's do another example here. I want to talk a little bit more about Flexbox. Now, it's got a lot of features. I don't want to go over every feature, but you'll notice that under links, it's like Flexbox something. Yeah, the site CSS tricks, this is always my go-to if I want to see how to lay things out in Flexbox. So we've talked about flex direction. You can either do row or column. You can actually reverse them. You'll learn that in Flexbox Froggy. I showed you how you can wrap these around. In practice, I very rarely wrap these things around, because once you start getting into wrapping, it almost makes sense to just grid. So I try not to do these things in 2 dimensions. We talked about justify content. Remember, we used this for our navigation. Most of the time we were using either space between or space around, but you can use it to center things as well. Now, the one thing we didn't talk about a whole lot was align items. Align items is when you're aligning on the cross axis. So this might seem a little bit obscure. Let's go ahead and do an example that should help you learn a little bit more about align items. So let's start off with our HTML shell. and call this example 2. So we're going to have our big container div that I always like to do. There we go. And inside of that, we're going to have 3 items. I know I'm kind of overusing the div tag a lot in a lot of these examples, but just makes the examples quicker. And each of these is going to contain lorem ipsum text. So I'm going to have a container, and then I'm going to have a class called item. And then what we're going to do is get lorem ipsum text of 3 different lengths. So let's do this. We'll do a long, a short, and a long. So arrange it however you need to, but we'll do a long. This might be a little bit, this should probably be okay. Something kind of shorter, so you can just reuse it and cut it in half if you want. And then something kind of in between, so something like this, okay? So like a long, short, and medium set of lorem ipsum text. What I'm going to do is just temporarily, I'm going to shrink this just so you get the big picture. I know this might be a little bit tough to see, but we've got a big div class, a big container class, and then 3 divs all belonging to the class item, and then we've got a large block of lorem ipsum, a smaller block of text, and then kind of a medium-sized block of text. Okay, is everybody good? Okay, so let's do this. Now let's hop up over to our, let's go ahead inside of the, make sure you're inside of the head section. Let's go ahead and put a style in here. And then we're going to have our 2 classes. We're going to have container, and we're going to have item. Now, at the very least, we know that since we're working with Flexbox, what we're going to do is we're going to display flex. Now, this example won't make a whole lot of sense without a background color. So it's like we see a bunch of text here, but this will make a little bit more sense with a background color. So for each of these items, let's go ahead and set a background color to, I don't know, it doesn't really matter. Cornflower blue, I guess, works. And then just add a little bit of margin so that they're like not up against each other. Okay, so you can see here what we have. So we've got our 2 classes. We've got our main container class that contains everything, and then our individual items within that container. Now, by default, the flex direction is going to be row, but sometimes it's nice just to put it just as a reminder. That's the direction that it's going to be flexing. Doesn't change it because that was the default anyway, but sometimes I like to put that. Okay, so here's where we're at right now. You can see this kind of made some effort to size these based on content. But what if I didn't want that? What if I wanted them to all be equal size? See what I'm talking about? See how these, like, this one had the most content, this first block, so this became the widest. But I might not want that. So what I can do is under our 3 divs, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add style equals, and then there's a property called flex. And you can almost think of these as like ratios. So what I'm going to do is on this first block of text, I'm going to say flex 1. The second block of text, I'm going to say style equals flex 2. And on the third block of text, I'm going to say style equals flex 1. So what this is doing is this is kind of creating like imaginary units. So if these added up to 4, right, 1 plus 2 plus 1, we're saying that this is going to take up 1/4. This is going to take up 2/4. This is going to take up half the screen on the width side. And this is going to take up 1/4, 1/4. Does that make sense what's going on? So we're not really working in percentages. It's almost like, yeah, exactly, fractions. And now when we view this, notice what happened. Just exactly that. This takes up 1/4. This takes up 1/2. And then this takes up another quarter. And so you could do these ratios however you want. You could set this to like 3, 5, 2. And this is nice because you're no longer having to deal with percentages. Because if you've ever noticed with the percentages, sometimes they don't add up correctly. Like if you end up with like 33% plus 33% plus 33%, that adds up to 99%. You've still got a little bit missing. These are nice because you're dealing with fractions that do add up. Okay. But let's go ahead and set it back just to 1, 2, 1. Now this kind of sets the stage. This is good because what you'll notice is that notice the background, that the actual div height, they're all the same. So by default, if we go back here, it's set to stretch. So if I were to type in, now this is under items. No, I'm sorry, this is under, not items, this is under container. And then we use this property align items. And right now it's set to stretch. So if I were to type in stretch, nothing would happen. It would look the exact same. Now if I wanted to take that content inside of it and center it along the middle, let's see what that does. Notice the difference. The actual item div doesn't take up the whole thing now. It just takes up as much of the text as it needs. Does it make sense what happened? Or we could set this to flex start. So you get the idea. Or if we wanted to align it all the way on the bottom, we could set it to flex end. But this is nice because this gives you some options. So right now we're working in the main axis is in the row direction. So align items is basically saying, okay, on the cross axis, how do I want to align these? Okay. Now I realize this. I wish they had come up with better terminology. But the main idea is that justify content is along the main axis. Align items is along the cross axis. If you're ever confused, this CSS tricks is a really good reference. I'll be honest, there's like 5 things I do in Flexbox on a regular basis. I have those memorized. Anytime I need to do anything out of the ordinary, I almost always have to go back to the site and kind of sketch it on a piece of paper. But just wanted to give you an idea how that works. So any questions on that? So align items is when you're going in the cross-axis direction. Okay, so let's do does anybody need to copy any code or can I move on? Okay. So this is just kind of a knowing that piece of information, knowing that we have justify content and align items. If I want to put something smack dab in just the middle of the page, that used to be a giant headache. It was, you needed all these different CSS tricks, but now with Flexbox, it's actually incredibly easy. So this example should probably be one of the quickest we have. So let's start off with a new HTML shell. This will be example 3. So we're going to have a div. This is going to be our container div. A div within that. That's going to be our item. And then we have some text we want to center. It could be text. It could be a picture, logo, whatever. So this outside thing here, this is going to be our main container. This is going to be our item. Now, normally vertically, the page when we have a page, it doesn't really take up the whole page. So let's go ahead and make sure you're in the head section. That's the first thing. Set up our style tag. And we're going to say the HTML tag and the body tag. We want this to be 100% height. There's also, I think you can also set viewport height, which I think is just like VH or something like that. This seems to work pretty reliably. What this is saying is that, okay, I want this height to be the full 100% height of the page. Then what we can do is we can define our container class. So first of all, we want to make sure that this is actually also taking up 100% of the height. Well, I already told you it's going to be Flexbox related, so we know that we're going to have to set our display to flex. Now on the main axis, if I want to center something, what property do I use? What was it called? Starts with a J. Justify content. Perfect. So what I can do is in this direction, because remember it defaults to row, so in the horizontal direction, I just sent justify content to center. Let's save and preview that. Perfect. So it's centered in the page. But what I want to do is I want to get this thing all the way over here in the middle. So what did we just talk about in the last example? What was that property called? Starts with an A. Align items. And remember, I told you we can do the same thing there. We can center in that direction. This may seem kind of silly. You're like, that's not big. All you just did was put in the middle of the screen. Probably for the first 20 years of HTML and CSS, doing that little silly thing required hacks. That might be an exaggeration, but it definitely was not an easy thing that could be done in just a few lines of code. And Flexbox really, really made a lot of this stuff easier. Basic stuff like putting content in the middle of the page used to be just like, you'd need IE hacks, you'd need different browser hacks, you'd need sometimes like JavaScript, and it was just, to me, this is incredibly simple. All we did was said, okay, center it in that direction, center it in that direction, and boom, we've got centered content. This is nice for if you've got, have you seen web pages before where they're really not meant to be scrolled? It's just like a single web page. And maybe like, for example, you're launching a new product and it's like a teaser page where you're saying like coming soon, and you've got, maybe a video in the background or something like that. You want to have just something very powerful right in the middle of the page. This would be an example of like that. Sometimes these don't scroll very well. So we'll just leave it at that, but it's a pretty quick example. Any questions on that? Has anybody done anything like that before in any of their classes that you actually centered in vertical and horizontal direction? Is that the first time you've seen that? Okay. I was just curious if anybody taught you the difficult way, which is, it's not great. Okay. So let's do this. A very common thing to do, and I sort of alluded to this on the Audubon Society webpage, is that if you've got some sort of navigation, you want to put a logo on the left, and then all this stuff on the right. We can actually do this with Flexbox. What we need to do is actually have two items. So what we're going to do is this whole thing right here is going to be a Flexbox. Let's ignore this top part for now. Let's just pretend that all we've got are our links and this logo. And what we can do is we can say, okay, we've got a container with two items. This is an item, and this whole thing right here is an item. Does it make sense what we're trying to do? Now, knowing that, what we can do is say, oh, okay, we've learned this before. All I have to do is justify content and just kind of say space between or space around, depending on how we want it to look. Okay, so let's go ahead and do an example like that. We're not going to use a real logo. I'm just going to write the word logo, but obviously you could go back and do that. So what do I want? Okay, so let's go to HTML shell. Start off there. So we'll make our big container div. And then now we're going to have two items. We're going to have our logo. And we'll even let's go ahead and make a class for it in case we want to do something with it. We'll call it logo. Just write my logo goes here. And then create a nav. I'm going to be lazy. I'm not going to make an unordered list. Let's just say class is equal to nav. And then let's, if we wanted to, we could make individual nav items. You could refactor this into a list, but I'm just going to be lazy for now. And I'm trying to get out of the habit of using everything of the same length. Sometimes you get some insight when you use, when you don't copy and paste the same text. So let's put in something sort of realistic like IRSC. So we'd have home, advising, registration. And, oops, contact. So now a lot of times when we write a lot of HTML, don't lose the big picture. The big picture is that we've got a big container. Then we're flexing two things. We're flexing the logo and the navigation. So let's go inside of the head section. Make sure you're inside of the head section and set up style. Let's start to fill some of this in. So I already told you it's going to be Flexbox. So we set displays to flex. Just to make our lives a little bit easier, let's go ahead and make this a fixed width container. We're going to say that the width is, we'll start off with 800 pixels. We'll see how that goes. Center it with margin auto. I still like this technique of a fixed width container with a margin auto for centering things. It might be, I don't know if there's a better way it's looked down upon, but it's such a simple way to do things that I still like to do it. Because then it works out if you've got a bunch of breakpoints, literally all you do is just change the width here. But anyway. Now we've got our logo and our nav. Let's just, so we can see what these things are doing, let's give them background colors. Aquamarine is fine, I guess. .nav. Is that what we called it? Yeah, nav. Something a little bit different. Cadet blue. So this kind of sort of did what we wanted it to. And just so we can see what we're working with, let's go ahead and do border 1 pixel solid black on the container. But we can improve this. Okay. So first of all, if we want them to take up equal spacing and use the whole container, remember I just showed you this, we can do flex 1. Flex 1. We could also probably have done space around, would have probably worked just as well, but we'll just do this for now, just so you get some practice doing things a couple different ways. So we've got the logo on the left, but this isn't really super ideal because we've got this vertical. What do you think we could do to make this horizontal? Well, we could use another Flexbox. There's no reason that we can't put Flexboxes inside of Flexboxes. So let's go ahead and do this. We've got this container called nav. This holds all of our navigation. Display flex. And what do you notice? All of a sudden, now inside of here, we've got a Flexbox inside of a Flexbox. Does that make sense? So we've got our main container and then 2 items, logo and nav. So logo is just a plain old item. But nav is kind of special because nav is acting as an item, but then it's also a container for nav item. Now don't forget that we have our justify content. So if I wanted to space these links out evenly, I could say, okay, justify content, and let's say space between. So inside of nav, what I can do is I can say justify content, space between. Now you may say, okay, well this is, I don't want it kind of halfway in the middle exactly. So then we could start to adjust how much this is flexing. So we could do like, this would be 2/3, this would be 1/3. That might work for your site, but you get the basic idea. Then you would spend the next, I don't know, half an hour trying to tidy this up. But this is kind of nice because then using this, we can essentially get this effect where we've got a logo on the side and then our links over here set up. Kind of an interesting thing. Okay. I know it's Mentally, sometimes it's a difficult leap to go from here to here. But then what you'd do is you'd pick out nice colors and fonts and make a logo and so on. But this is more about the layout. Okay. Any questions on that? That we had a big container that was flexing the two items, our navigation and our logo and our navigation. And then navigation itself was also acting as a container for a Flexbox. Everyone's good?
Could you go back to the code, please?
Yeah.
That example.
Which part do you need, the HTML or the CSS?
The HTML.
We didn't use this nav item. We can actually get rid of this. I thought I might need it, but oops. And I'll add a little spacing to make this more readable. You good? Okay. Okay, so that's about as much as I want to do with Flexbox. You get the idea. It's pretty powerful. It's when you want to lay out things in one direction. So navigation was a good example. If we've got some text, like blocks of text, it usually works pretty well. If we want to put things side by side, it tends to work well. If we want to do some things with centering. However, if we want to put things in a grid formation when we're dealing with two directions at the same time, that's when we move over to something called grid. So we'll do a very, very basic example of grid. Just to take a step back here, I'll tell you what your homework is. I realize I'm throwing a lot at you. So what I did is, so right now you have assignment number 3 is due in 1 week. Rather than giving you another difficult assignment, this Flexbox Froggy is just kind of a fun little thing. Most people should be able to finish it in half an hour, 45 minutes or something like that. This will be due in 2 weeks. You could finish it. You don't need like anything else other than the site. So if you've just got some extra time, and then to turn in your work, all you have to do is just give me a screenshot of the completed levels. Like if you click this drop down, every level that you complete shows up as green. What I say, up to level 13. Okay, and it just gives you practice. Like, okay, so here we're working with justify content. Remember, justify content was in this. We're working with row, and justify content is on the main axis. So this is the direction we're talking about. So I'd say, and it gives you a hint too. It says, hey, you're working with justify content. So I'd say justify content, and then let me see my options here. Flex start, flex end, center. And then you could even experiment and say, okay, well, what does center do? Well, it puts it in the center. That's interesting. What does flex start do? Well, that's the default. It started at the beginning. Well, if that started at the beginning, what does flex end do? Perfect. And then you go on to the next level. Okay? Doesn't require too much thought or creativity. It's just like a practice thing. Is anybody stuck on any part of assignment number 3? Use that code from last week, example 2, as your starter template. Usually what I like to do is give you I try to get you 90% of the way there, and then I just want you to start adding in color and adding in detail work, and sometimes it'll be something small, like go from 2 columns to 3 columns. But if you find yourself writing it from scratch, you're probably going in the wrong direction. Start off with this example. And don't forget that I always post the code here under class examples, okay? Okay, so let's get started with grid. And this is going to be great because once you know Flexbox and grid, that's modern web development. We're not dealing with all these old, antiquated ways of the past. Remember I told you that at some point we're going to get to actual modern web design and web development. these two techniques, Flexbox and grid, these represent the state of the art. Like if you were to go out in the workforce right now and start writing CSS and HTML, these would be the techniques you'd be using. You might actually be ahead of some people because these are actually pretty new techniques. Okay, so under links, there aren't a whole lot of good websites. There's a few YouTube videos I may post. Sometimes, unfortunately, with these YouTube videos, they intend to be complete. And I don't really need to teach you everything about grid. I just need to teach you enough that you kind of get a sense of how it works. But W3 Schools has a little page on grid. You get the idea, is that here we're working in two directions. Okay, so what happens is here is we have a row that takes up everything. And then here, this row takes up two columns. And then this takes up however much, maybe whatever number of units they used. And then here, same deal, okay? So this is, again, you wouldn't really be able to do this reasonably in Flexbox. By far the simplest way to use grid is just to say, okay, I've got this grid. What you do is you give it a template. You say, okay, so turn on, remember before we did display Flexbox? Now here we say display grid. And then now we set it up template columns. And what happens is we do 1, 2, 3, 4 items. And then what happens is, say for example, we have 8 items. It would do 4, and then it would wrap around to the next row automatically. Does that make sense? So in this case, by setting it to auto, what we're doing is we're saying evenly space these, and once we run out of space, wrap it around to the next line. Okay, so let's get some practice doing that. Let's write it from scratch. So let's do this. Oops. So we're going to have a container div. And then some items. Let's do 6. So A, B, C. So this is our setup. We've got 6 items that we want to display in a grid. Now if I go up here inside of the head section, add my style tag. So on this container, what I do is instead of, remember before we said display flex, instead I'm going to say, hey, I want to display it as a grid. And then there's this property where we can set it up as a template. We can say grid template columns. And let's just see what auto gets us. And then just so we can kind of see these individual items, let's just do a little bit of styling to make the item easier to see. Let's give it a background color. Something like a light gray, or light blue, I guess, light cyan. Should work. I don't know, anything really. Get it blue. Oops. Sometimes it's nice to have a border radius. just to see, just when things kind of go up against each other, you kind of see the curves. So let's hit some border radius, say 10 pixels. Maybe a large font size. Let's do a darker color. I don't like light cyan. Dark goldenrod. Let's see how well that works. We'll just set our color to white. How about that? And add in some padding so we can actually see this thing. So padding. Okay, there we go. So what you'll notice is, I know I added kind of a lot of styling here. Does anybody need me to leave this up for another second, or are you good?
Yes.
Okay. So in our container, we set the display as grid. We said, hey, we're using grid, CSS grid. And then we're setting up the template. And we're saying that it's just going to be automatic. We're going to fill up whatever it fills up. Yeah.
What's the difference between putting a percentage and putting a pixel count?
This is basically saying that's 150% of what it's normally supposed to be. We can set a pixel size if that's confusing. We can say like 30 pixels. Either one works. When you're doing percentages, 100% is kind of like the base size, and then so if you do 150%, you're saying okay, make it 150% of the normal size it is. Now there's a nice little grid property if we want to. It's not exactly a good idea to set margins on these things because grid works a little bit different. So the closest thing we have to margin is called grid gap. Now notice it set up some gaps for us. And you can either set grid gaps in the row direction or the column direction. If you just set it grid gap, it sets it in both directions. But notice that we only set it, we're saying each column, it's going to be 3 items. And then once we have more content than columns, it wrapped around. Does everyone see that? So what would happen if I added G? What do you think? Exactly, it wraps it around under, and we'd have just kind of one hanging out there by himself. This is pretty cool because if you've got like a dynamic system where it's generated content from a database, you don't have to plan ahead too much because it tends to act pretty nicely. It flows around kind of in a nice way. Now, we don't always have to deal with this. What we can do instead of setting auto, we can actually set pixel widths. So say, for example, we want to do 200 pixels, 100 pixels, 300 pixels. We could do that. So it's saying that the first column is going to be 200 pixels, and you get the idea. I had one more example, but I don't think we'll have time today. I'll just do a little bit more with this example. What I wanted to do was take these, and remember the card we made earlier? I wanted to actually take this grid and make something like this, but we'll do that next time. We'll do we'll spend the whole class doing one website next class. Now, we already ran into this issue with percentages and pixels and stuff that Sometimes it's easier just to almost use like a ratio. So instead of grid, they have what's called a fractional unit. Okay? And so remember when flex, we just put like 1, 2, or 3. In grid, we actually add FR. So this stands for 1 fractional unit, 3 fractional units, 2 fractional units. Okay, so this is going to be the base size. It's saying that this is going to be 3 times as wide as that base size, and this is going to be twice as wide as that base size. Everyone understand this? These fractional units. So we have a lot of different options. Okay, so I think that's as much as I want to do with grid. This was just sort of an introduction. I'll tell you, even though we can do all kinds of really cool things. Did I already close it? Grid. Even though we can do cool things like this, I tend not to see this very often on websites. I will tell you, probably the only website, not the only, but the most interesting use of this I've seen is New York Times. And so if you're ever curious, you can just kind of browse the New York Times website, because they do a lot of this to really get their content to. It's almost like a jigsaw puzzle where you're getting things, or more like Tetris, I guess, where you're kind of getting things to fit together onto the page. It's pretty interesting use. In practice, I would say most websites actually do something more along the lines of this, where we've got a bunch of cards in a very simple grid formation. Personally, I like this, even though it's a little bit more boring, is that a lot of times you have to kind of know your audience. And in this case, people on the Audubon Society are probably not looking for the latest, greatest design. They just want to learn some stuff about birds. So simple design in this case is probably good. And to be honest, just with what we've learned so far between Flexbox and grid, given enough time, I think most people in here could recreate this. You have all the basic materials. You could make this a grid or Flexbox, and then set this up to be, 3 units, 1 unit. You already know how to make a card. This just has the image on the top and the image on the bottom. You know how to make these cards with a grid. And one of the things that we're going to work on next week is making mobile-friendly designs. So when we have a grid, that we want to reset up that template. Instead of grid template columns being 3 columns, we want to collapse it down to 1 column. But we can do cool things, like we can say, okay, on a desktop I want it to be 4 columns wide. On a tablet I want it to be 2 columns wide, and then when I hit a cell phone, drop it down to 1 column. Okay. And then we'll get to cheat, and we'll get to use other libraries like Bootstrap, but you'll know all the fundamentals. Okay, only a couple minutes left. Any questions before we go? Any question at all about the assignment where anybody feels stuck on anything? Did seeing an example of a card, did that help you?
Yes.
Okay, so use that example 1. Is there anything else that you're kind of unclear about on that assignment? Okay. All right, as always, shoot me an email. I'll get these examples that we did today uploaded. Everyone knows how to actually get to the examples, correct? You just go to class examples and then the date. If you at all feel lost on anything, shoot me an email. Don't feel embarrassed, because a lot of times if you feel lost, there's probably other people. But I just want to kind of gauge the class. Does everyone feel pretty comfortable with this content? I know the audience. I know everyone in here doesn't necessarily want to be a web designer as a career. I know for a lot of you this is a required class, but hopefully along the way you can learn something useful. So, okay. No questions. I'll see everybody next week, and just shoot me an email if you get stuck in any part of the assignment.